The Middle Passage is really the voyage across the Atlantic Ocean. It would never know the number of Africans who embarked on the Middle Passage. Some historians estimate nearly 12 or 20 million Africans were involved in the horror of the Middle Passage. It is conjectured that more than a third of the captured Africans died during the Middle Passage. In other words, thousands of our African ancestors are buried in the Atlantic Ocean. Some said over millions are buried in the Atlantic Ocean, but they were captured and they were not able to make the voyage as they were coming across the Atlantic Ocean. It was a horrible situation. In other words, the space reserved on the slave ship for Africans was called the hold, which was at the bottom of the ship where there was no sunlight. The space where the Africans resided was about the size of a casket, and the voyage sometimes would take from 6 to 10 weeks. Some were cramped on benches. Chains, well, many of them were chained together, and sometimes the chain mate would die and remain chained for a long time. This was the horror of the Middle Passage. It is called the Middle Passage. And there were people on the ship. There were no bathroom facilities. People would get sick. They would be vomiting. There was diarrhea. There was typhoid fever. There was yellow fever. There was smallpox. And there was scurvy. And still they had to remain on this ship. That's the reason, class, that I say this was too painful to remember and too dangerous to forget. And then on the Middle Passage, there's a story of an African who was punished, who had a baby, and the baby was beaten for things that was out of her control, and almost beaten to death by the slave captain because of this. There's another story on one of the ships. The mother had a child, and the child would not eat because the child was so young. And the slave captain took a hot rod and put it on the baby's lip, try to make the baby eat. And then when the baby didn't eat because the baby was too young, the captain killed the baby. And after the captain killed the baby, he made the baby's mother throw the baby overboard. This was the horror of the Middle Passage. On the Middle Passage, when the Africans rebelled by refusing to eat, the ship captain would apply a hot red iron to the lips of the slaves to force him or her to open their mouths in order to force food down their throats. This was important because, remember, the African slaves were not considered as people. They were considered as chattel. They were cargo. And the more of the cargo that the slave captain was able to bring to the shores of America, the more money that they would receive for the stock load of ships, of cargo of African slaves. A slave trader did not have to make more than 2 or 3 trips. And after a slave trader made 2 or 3 trips, he and most of the men, they were rich because they did not need any more money after this was done, because they had made it successful. It's also very interesting, ministers, I mean, many of you in the class are ministers, and this has always interested me, and this is a geographical fact, that all of the hurricanes that cross, the Atlantic Ocean during hurricane season, all of them originate in West Africa. And believe it or not, the hurricanes follow the course, follow the route, follow the travel pattern of the slave ships. And it's interesting that every hurricane originates in Africa, and they kind of follow the route of the slave ship. And sometimes as ministers, I think there are many ministers in my class, is that I let my sanctified imagination kind of run away with me. And I believe that this could be the spirits of our African ancestors crying up from the Atlantic Ocean. I don't know about this in terms of the scientific principles of this, but in terms of a faith venture, I would go so far as to say that could be a possibility. There were so many African bodies buried in the waters of the Atlantic Ocean after being thrown overboard until sharks would follow the slave ships waiting for the next black body. And this was a part of the thing that we talk about when we talk about the Middle Passage. Oh, that should be ingrained in your mind. Too dangerous, to forget, and too painful to remember, the Middle Passage.